AI. It's literally everywhere.
Godfather of artificial intelligence has quit his job.
Oh, I'll just GPT it.
The artificial intelligence company OpenAI.
Should we allow AI machines to flood the internet with propaganda?
AI to make AI. AI first, generative AI. Third, AI, deploying AI. Finally, rigorously tested AI.
Building AI.
Your friends use it,
Your teachers and employers ban you from using it,
and you might think it'll take over the world.
but to find out what it really is, we sat down with Hugging Face's research lead, Nazneen Rajani, and asked what really got you interested in the field of AI.
He used to tell me that AI would be big, in a decade or two. And I actually took that and trained a simple net to play this game of tic-tac-toe.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the Hugging Face?
You can think of it as the open source version of OpenAI, but then who decides when to pull the plug?
How did they learn how to develop this AI?
Computer vision was coming up, deep learning had just begun. After that, it just took off.
How do you think AI can be used in everyday scenarios?
Throughout this podcast, you'll hear a few AI-related terms being mentioned. So here's a few quick definitions.
Artificial intelligence, or AI, the capability of a machine to imitate human behavior.
Machine learning, or ML, a kind of AI that learns and gets better at tasks by analyzing data over time.
Artificial general intelligence, or AGI, an AI system that can understand or learn any intellectual task that a human being can.
Large language models, or LLMs, a type of machine learning model that can generate text, such as ChatGPT.
Natural language processing, or NLP, a way computers can understand and communicate with humans in everyday language.
Robustness, an AI's ability to handle unexpected or challenging situations and still perform well.
Neural networks,
Systems that identify patterns in data, like how our brain processes information.
Welcome to the Journey Tellers podcast. What really got you interested in the field of AI? What kind of led you up to that?
I would say my father had a big hand in that. So growing up, I remember my father used to talk about artificial intelligence to me. This was back in 6th or 7th grade, and he used to tell me that AI would be big, in a decade or two. So you should try to see if that is something that is of interest to you. I even took electives in my college. This was in my undergrad, which I did it back in India from BITS Pilani. And over there, I took 2 electives. One was on artificial neural networks, and the other one was on artificial intelligence. We basically used the same textbook that is over here, and my PhD and my the college or the graduate school year, which is by Peter Norvig and Stuart Russell. It's a very classic AI book. And so over there at that time, when I was learning from these books, I realized that it was very interesting how you can train algorithms to find patterns in data and then generalize to new data sets. Mm-hmm. So that really was was very, very interesting to me. And the class on artificial neural networks, it was about how our brains, how the neurons in our brains are connected and how they send signal to each other, and how we have all these memories about when we see something, how we remember them. And similarly, can we train a neural network to sort of simulate that behavior? So that I thought was very interesting, and I actually took that and made a very simple, I trained a simple net to just play this game of tic-tac-toe, a very simple n by n thing, matrix, and then you put there are 2 opponents x and zeros, and then you place them, and so one is the AI and the other is the human. And it was a very simple thing, and I actually was able to publish that, and this was in my 3rd year of undergrad, so I was just 19 years old at that time. That was my first research paper. And that really got me very motivated, and I was okay, this seems there's something over here, to learn more, do more research, and then that's how I actually got into AI.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I like that. So can you talk to us a little bit about the Hugging Face and what exactly it does and what you do now?
Yeah, so Hugging Face, you can think of it as the open source version of OpenAI. So we very much build and train these large language models. We have a lot of ethical focused decisions and around building technology. So our mission is to like democratize, make it accessible to many people, so that these powerful technology is not concentrated in the hands of a few people, which we see right now with like ChatGPT and GPT-4, which are like closed models. No one has access to it. You can just use it via API or like through an interface to query it. But they have been like, they can keep updating behind it, and you wouldn't know who you are exactly, what model or what version of the model you're chatting with at that point. The thing with open source, like, obviously, like, you have to be cognizant of the risks with it. With closed models, you can just sort of pull the plug, like the way they call it, and then, the access is cut off. But then, like, who decides when to pull the plug, right? And so, like, that time, like, you can stop the harm at that moment. But with open source, because, like, the models are out there, people can build off of it. And, it can just, like, it's very hard to control the usage and, like, this distribution of these models. But on the other hand, you actually empower people to build things on their own. And we saw that, like, when OpenAI released the DALL-E model, which is this text-to-image generation model, you could write a prompt, like, generate an image of a scenery with, like, with the, of someone having lunch with, like, the Eiffel Tower in the background or something. And it would, like, do a very accurate description. I saw a lot of, like, these Muslim artists doing that with, like, really nice shrines and, like, Islamic art and stuff, which is really amazing. And these are, like, very positive use cases of these. And then right after that, like, Stability AI is another, like, company which focuses on open sourcing models. And they came up with, like, Stable Diffusion, which is, like, the DALL-E alternative for open sourcing. And then we saw, like, a lot more progress and acceleration in these models and technology. And people are so creative. They have, like, taken this to a different level. And, almost no one, like, actually, I don't know how many people actually use DALL-E, or, like, everyone's, like, focused on, like, using open source model because you have more control over it. And you can actually, like, see where you deploy it. You can fine tune it on your own data sets and stuff. And similarly for ChatGPT, like, you could, like, people are going to come out. Again, Hugging Face is doing that. We are building our own open source version of ChatGPT. It's called the HuggingChat. And the idea is to, like, similarly, like, just to empower people to be able to, like, control and build their own models and deploy it when they want.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I wanted to actually talk about, so originally, around a year ago, I remember thinking that AI is, like, not really at, like, a nice point yet, at a point where it's actually useful to human beings, like, at least widespread AI. I remember thinking that, and I was, like, kind of, like, annoyed that, like, we have all this advanced technology, but we don't really have good AI at all yet. And then just around that time, I'd found out about the DALL-E Mini. So I think that was, like, the original version of DALL-E or something like that by OpenAI. I'm not sure if it was by OpenAI, right?
No, so DALL-E Mini was the open source version of DALL-E. Yeah.
Interesting. So yeah, I found out about that. I was like, okay, this is pretty cool, but yeah, the results from that weren't that great. They were pretty bad looking. But then around then, this DALL-E 2 was released. So I was like, okay, this is really cool. This is, like, actually really crazy and stuff. I mean, the examples and stuff I was seeing in the news were like wow. I mean, you have, like, really cool looking stuff that look almost like completely like a normal picture. But then, yeah, I remember then afterwards, then Stable Diffusion released, and that was, like, the next big thing. And then everyone was, like, building off of it. Everyone had their own versions. There were so many versions. And in a way, you could look at that as, like, something that's negative because then it's not controlled. But on the other hand, it's positive because there's so many variations of it, and it, like, shows creativity and stuff. But I want to talk to you about the HuggingChat that you mentioned. So I had seen that recently come out in the news and stuff. What is that? Is that based on any other previous language models, or is it its own language model?
Yeah, so right now HuggingChat is just like an open source interface for supporting any open source chatbots. So you could select any of the, like, recently we have seen a lot of these chatbots also being dropped open source, shared on, like, even the Hugging Face hub. So HuggingChat is just like an open source interface for it. Right now it is powered by Open Assistant, which is the Stability AI's model for a version of a chatbot. Very soon we are going to, like, release our own version of a chatbot. And I think just to go back to your point of, like, how much things have accelerated in 1 year, and I wanted to, like, highlight why this has happened. Like, how did we go from GPT-3 to ChatGPT? So GPT-3 came out, like, over 2 years ago, and at that point, like, it took people almost 14 months or year and a half to come up with the open source version of this maze model. And now things have been accelerating much faster, and the gaps between a closed model and the open and very similar open source version of that model is closing very much very quickly, even at the pace of a few weeks at the max. And the reason for that is that this compute, these big technology, these big, large, powerful language models, they are being trained on GPUs, and a lot of people now have made this is very accessible to a lot of people. You need probably I heard the ChatGPT took 10 million for training it because of the compute cost. You have to train these on these really big NVIDIA GPU chips or any other companies GPU chips. And it's really that is kind of the bottleneck, right? How much compute can you afford? But recently we have seen this community coming together and pooling these resources to train these models together. And the reason the whole reason the Stability.ai exists as a company and a startup is because they kind of managed to pool people, build a community around this, hey, let's just pool our resources and train these large language models and just open source so that it actually impacts and is a positive thing for the entire community. We're giving it back, right? So that sort of a thing. So that kind of really helped. And now we have seen even, I don't know if you've heard of this red pajama effort, it's from this company called Together, and they released the data sets. The data set for these training these large language models is huge. It's in the order of trillions of words. And just to put that in context, if as a human, if you read say 30,000 words an hour, and if you read every day for 3 hours, then in your entire lifetime you would have read 7 billion words. But these large language models, they are so huge that they are trained on 1.5 trillion tokens. It's orders of magnitudes way more than what a human would have read in their entire lives. So just that data to crawl it and collect it and process it is an effort that would take a huge team to do it, right? And so people are now open sourcing the data itself, which is scraping from the internet and everywhere. These books, Wikipedia, all of these that you can imagine. And so now it's basically everything is moving towards empowering people. Let them have the data set, let them have the compute to train their own models, and that is why we can see this gap decreasing and suddenly going from very powerful models in the closed with little access, just the interface that you access them to actual open models where you can play with them and fine tune them and deploy them and build on top of them for your domain and use cases.
Wow. That is really interesting. So, this whole time I was thinking you mentioned about giving back the AI to the community, right? So about that community, how did they learn how to develop this AI? When you went to college, right? Did you take classes? Were there classes teaching this stuff, or how were you able to learn that?
Yeah, it's interesting and it's funny because when I started grad school, and that's when I immigrated here to the US back 2012, right after my undergrad, exactly about 10 years ago. And at that time, when I was doing my PhD, I decided to I took this class on natural language processing, which was training these machine learning algorithms. At that time, very traditional, very classic, very small models that you could train on your laptops. And then, just giving them a bunch of text data and teaching them to find patterns in them and make predictions, doing things like sentiment analysis or recommender systems and all these very classic natural language processing tasks. And at that time, 2012 was the ImageNet moment for AI, in the sense that computer vision was coming up, deep learning had just begun, and the first ever deep learning model was trained, which is called the AlexNet, on tons of images from the internet. And that's what the ImageNet data set is, which came out from Stanford. And so we saw for the first time that a machine learning model performing at the level of humans. And this was exactly about 10 years ago. And at that time, computer vision, it was a big opportunity because there was finally a model that could do text classification on 1,000 different classes. So like cat, dogs, humans, all these things you can imagine at the level of a human, right? So that was like pretty good. And then after that, it just took off. And a lot of people started working in this domain, creating like these huge, very deep neural networks, very, very big networks. And when I say like these neural networks, like, just to give an analogy so that it's easier to understand, you can imagine like they have what we call weights, which you can imagine as knobs. So what we are trying to do when we train them and give the input as an image and trying to make it classify if this image has a cat or dog and so on, what we're trying to do here is to tune its weights. So think of it as a knob. So like you want to find what is the right setting of all these like different thousands, or like right now it's at the order of billions of these knobs or parameters, and you want to tune them so that it learns exactly like when I give it an image, like to make a correct prediction. And so that the way the tuning works is by the thing called like training an algorithm. And so that was the image and moment. And then when I was in college, I was actually more interested in text and natural language processing. And so it was almost seemed like I was doing something that was like the neglected child of deep learning, right? It wasn't like, they never thought that deep learning could actually be applied that much to natural language processing, although there were like some networks like, RNNs and LSTMs that came about at that time. But it's right when I graduated that, like the transformers came out, like, 2017 is the transform, which is like the kind of the building blocks or the horsepower behind like, what is behind these like, GPT-3 and all these like language models, like the architecture or the neural network architecture that's powering them. So that happened right about when I was about to finish my PhD. And so it was kind of like I was almost like going against the tide, like I wasn't doing what was cool at the time. But alhamdulillah, I'm glad like, I stayed the course and like, kept pushing because I like doing that. And like right when I graduated, I figured like, language models started coming about, and like, these were like getting really popular, which was like back in 2018. And now they are like very like commonplace. Everyone knows about them.
That's interesting. So I wanted to ask a quick question. So, up until the release of ChatGPT, AI kind of seemed like a bit of like a nerdy type of thing to use. The people who like used AI kind of was like, okay, like why are you using that? That's kind of like too scientific, too much like computer related stuff to it. Why do you think that, like in your opinion, why do you think that with the release of ChatGPT, suddenly it seemed like everything took off in AI? Like everything, I know you mentioned that like all these things, the GPUs, it's getting like easier and easier to train it. But why do you think it was specifically the launch of ChatGPT that kind of made it kind of switched things around, especially for students and stuff? Like now, if you're not using AI, you're kind of like a nerd to not be using AI. But like before it used to be the opposite. Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think, no, that's a good point. And yeah, that's definitely a case that I think ChatGPT made it more like commonplace and for people to know exactly like, what these large language models are doing, and people became more curious about like, what is powering them, like the risks associated with them. I would say like the thing that kind of makes ChatGPT really good is this idea of RLHF, which is like reinforcement learning with human feedback. And so I can like, maybe take like a few minutes just to explain like, how these models are trained. So there's usually like 3 steps in training these large language models. The first step is called pre-training, wherein you just give it a bunch of text and you train it in the way like, you're just, the loss function or the objective is to just predict the next token. And that idea is called pre-training, and that's what like most of the data is used for. And most of it is unlabeled. It's just raw text, just, removing some like, characters and punctuation, things like that. You can do like a little bit of pre-processing, but most of it is just raw text. And it is trained to like predict the next word. And most of the data goes into that. And that's called pre-training. At that point, and that is what, this GPT-3 or what we call like the base model or foundation model. And that's what like a model like GPT-3 is. But if you like chat with GPT-3, or at least like the first versions of GPT-3, you'd find that you wouldn't have the experience that you have with ChatGPT. And it's very easy to also make it generate misinformation, make it like generate really harmful text. Like it can even, if you tell it to like complete the following sentence, you should just go kill, and it will actually generate something very harmful. So it's very easy for GPT-3 to generate these things. The thing that happens, like the actual magic or the actual thing that, makes it, very very like chatty and like something that is very cool and people are like really attracted to is this next two steps of training. The second step is called like the instruction tuning or supervised training. And in this, what you do is that you give it examples of what chatting instruction or conversations would look like. And these are written by humans. So humans write down like, brainstorm a list of recipes that includes like, so-and-so ingredients. And then they also write what that would look like. So they demonstrate, examples of things that are very interesting. So, and it could be like, summarize the following text for me and then provide the text and also the summary for it. So because there's like these annotations or these like outputs or demonstrations that humans are providing, it's more like supervised learning. As contrast this to like the first step where there was no annotation and no labeling of the data set. And so in that thing, like when we do the second step, instruction tuning, we end up with a model that is really chatty and that knows like, way to like, it's kind of like give more open-ended outputs and generations. And it knows exactly sort of like, ways in which it should like, what is the kind of thing that people care about and like, things that, the kind of outputs that people would like to see. So because of those demonstrations from humans, it has learned to do that. And the final step is called like reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is the very final thing. It's almost like aligning the model to the human values that you care about, or like the creators of the model care about. And in this step, what you do is that instead of having humans write the outputs, you take the outputs from the model, but then rank them so that so humans rank them and tell them that, okay, this is a good output and this is not a good output. And then train it further on that so that it knows that, okay, these are the kind of outputs that, that are good to generate and these are not. So it has like, both positive and negative signal for it to learn from. In the second step, it just had a positive signal. And the way it helps is that suppose if I ask the ChatGPT a question that probably it doesn't know about, right? Like who is the current president of the US? Maybe its training data has a cutoff beyond, like, which is kind of like beyond that range. Then it can say something like, I don't know, as opposed to like generating misinformation or generating things that are not factual. And this is the kind of thing that it learns from this last final step. It also like learns a lot of like things about like, okay, not to generate harmful text and not to generate misinformation. So all these like kind of like doing value alignment and adding the guardrails to the model that unfortunately GPT-3 lagged happens in like this final step. So I would say like these two last steps kind of really make it go from GPT-3 to ChatGPT, which kind of is a very different experience when you like chatting with it. Like.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think that part of like I didn't realize there were so many levels of training to it, but even that latest part that you're talking about, the one with the human feedback, you still see that in ChatGPT itself sometimes, where I think when you tell it to like regenerate a response, you can rank it whether it was worse, better, or just like same, I think. So yeah, I think that's really cool.
And also like, I don't know if you saw like the Anthropic's model, it was called the Claude. It was also integrated with Slack. And you could actually like, it generates a response and you have to give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. So they're obviously logging all the data. OpenAI, everyone does it. But like a lot of them are also logging the feedback that you give. So even next to ChatGPT, you can see it's like thumbs up or thumbs down, like whether you approve or not approve. But Anthropic in particular made it like, only if you can only proceed after you gave it that feedback. So then only it will generate the next response or you can do the next turn of things. So yeah, definitely they're like using that a lot.
So now that we know more about Sister Nazneen and her journey, we have a few questions about the future of AI.
Could you explain the distinction between a traditional computer and an artificial intelligence? So like, for example, a computer which runs on a code and it's given numbers and it runs on that code that's given to it versus an AI that analyzes data and thinks for itself?
So I would say like the first one is very well defined and it is something that you can formally verify. So a function that takes in like, say, for example, you say like the type is 2 integers or it could be like 2 float or any sort of type of that inputs. And then it does, whatever the addition or whatever the way it is structured to like add 2 numbers and then generate an output, right? And so in this case, you can say like, okay, this is the input. These are the steps that are going to happen. And then this is the output. You can go back and formally verify, given any 2 inputs, what exactly happened at each step. And then how did it get to the final answer? Now, contrast this with the AI that is, trained to learn to like add numbers. It is used like the way because like they use all these data sets and finding patterns in data set, they learn to generalize. So it doesn't just like add numbers, it can add numbers in like and like anything, like you can give it like an open-ended question, and you can say that suppose that there were 3 apples over here, and then someone came up with like 2 apples, and now how many apples are there? It can be like, it doesn't have to be very clear cut, like it can generalize from that as well. It can also like use what it learned to apply it to another task. So it's similar to like a child, right? Like you teach a child to addition, the child is not going to just use it and like every time you just ask them in a particular way, like what is 3 plus 2? You teach them that way, but then you can like give them a task like can you get me like 5 apples in a basket? They go there and they see there's already 2 apples, they just need to add 3 more and then get the basket to you. They can use like you taught them addition to apply it to that task as well. Similarly for AI, it can do that, but a software function which is traditionally defined is very deterministic, and so it works in a certain way. You can go back, verify what happened at each step and how you came to the output. But for AI, that's not the case. It's very stochastic. It's not deterministic. So like you can give it, but the good side of this is that you can give it in any format, any type, and it can also use what it learned from like the data to apply it to other tasks as well. So it's like this generalizing capability.
That's interesting, yeah. So the next question is, how do you think AI can be used in like everyday scenarios? For example, tools like ChatGPT, I mean, for most people, they use it like here and there. For example, give me a recipe, give me an essay for this, give me all of that. But can you describe a few scenarios where AI has already made a significant impact on our daily lives and how it could have potentially make even more of an impact in the future?
I think like, so something like ChatGPT or like this generative AI technology, I think the biggest dent they have made is in anything that is related to like writing or documentation. We will, whether that's like creative writing, technical writing, creating images, editing, and so on. I would say like, coding assistant, that's like the biggest tool. I cannot live without it. It's like, I use that every day. Like you can basically like say, write a function to do this, or write, whatever code to do, or even write, build an app or something, and it will do that for you. You can do like, it's like a pair programming buddy almost. We also have like ChatGPT plugins for making presentations. I think that's like the biggest help for me. I generally have this writer's block when I'm like writing something, and you probably know better than me about essays and like helping you with your school essays and homework. And then there's also, sorry, hold on. I don't know if I have. Anything that requires reading a lot. So like, you can imagine like, people in like, the legal industry or finance, marketing, where they have to like, review a lot of documents and then summarize and like, make presentations or like get answers out of them. Like, doing the work of a paralegal, for example, is to like, look at all these things. And like, I think ChatGPT as a tool would be really good at this. Like, just give it a bunch of text, because they have very good big context windows, so they can like, have like read a lot of new text and then like summarize it for you, or like, extract answers from that for you. So I think these are like things that I can see that every day would be very useful.
Interesting.
Right on. Sounds good. Another question we had is, how could AI be dangerous, and what are some of the potential risks associated with developing and deploying AI systems, and how can we mitigate these risks?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of like really pressing issues, and one of the things that I'm also interested in is this, the ethics around AI and like, the disparate impact it has on like people of different demographics, right? Because like, we have been discussing about these data sets a lot. A lot of the data set, is coming from, it's not basically representing minorities or people of color, women appropriately, and so it can actually, have really bad or harmful impact on, people of these demographics. Another problem is this problem of hallucination or misinformation. I actually recently read somewhere that a lot of people, like a lot of blogs and articles and even like, the newspapers that are actually using ChatGPT or some of these models to like, write these or like help them, assist them in reviewing these. And so if there's like a certain like kind of a misinformation or like factual thing that was like overlooked, it can actually like kind of spread very quickly. And I mean, we know like people have been like people, basically it's very like, especially during like all these like election campaigns and stuff, we see like a lot of these like video, even like right now it's like deep fakes and like videos being created by AI that go around and circulate and go viral, and it's hard to attribute whether it's like coming from an AI model or from a human. And there was like work on like watermarking these, so but even these are like not that great. In fact I saw a research paper that said that the essays or like inputs or prompts that were written by non-native speakers were classified as though it's being generated by ChatGPT, even though it wasn't. So it was again like having like a disparate impact on those people. And the ones that were like really good and were actually using ChatGPT as an assistant to like make their essays better were being classified as being written by humans. So you can already see like how like even watermarking and all these things are not doing as well. The idea behind watermarking was to say that you could put it through a detector and it would say whether it's coming from ChatGPT or a human. So that was the other thing. I already mentioned about deep fakes. The another problem is obviously like data privacy and like copyright issues. So you guys probably saw like with Dolly and even like all these other models like text to image, like they use all these images and arts from all these artists, and like now like because of the scale at which they operate, like something like GPT, like a Dolly or a stable diffusion model can generate images in a few seconds, which would take an artist like several weeks or months to create, right? And so that's kind of like again like problematic, like copyright issues. You have like there have been like kind of lawsuits against like some of these companies that are training models on this data set. The other thing is also privacy. We know, and like there have been research on that. You could prompt these models to generate people's phone numbers, addresses, even social security. So because they've been like trained on much of the internet, like even in any of this information that's out there can leak into this, and like you can prompt them in a certain way to get this out. So there are obviously issues around privacy as well. And the most pressing and final issue that I want to talk about is that nowadays like these large language models are being used as agents, in the sense that they have their own agency to act on behalf of someone, which is like the way they work right now is that they access your browser and you can just tell it like book a flight from say San Francisco to New York, and it can do that, which is maybe a positive thing. But then once you have access to the internet and the browser, like the possibilities are infinite, right? Like now I even saw an example where your person used like TaskRabbit to order chemicals to someone's house, like so things can like go like escalate very quickly at that sense, and like there are like real issues with risks and the outcomes of like what can go wrong with these models.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. So I wanted to add a point about, you mentioned at the end how like when you connect it to the internet, I mean, anything can happen. There was this story, I think it was from OpenAI itself, that when they were training GPT-4, they gave it access, they temporarily connected to the internet. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but somehow it went and it like came across a CAPTCHA, and it actually hired someone to solve the CAPTCHA for itself.
Yeah.
And then it was like, not only did it get someone to solve the CAPTCHA, the person asked it,
are you human?
Like, are you a human, or why do you need me? And the AI at this time, it's writing out every step it does. So it's like, if I want to continue, I need to lie about this. So then it makes up a lie about like being visually impaired or something like that, and then it gets that person and it continues with that. So yeah, it's really crazy.
I think I definitely agree, and I think this is also like this definitely went viral, and I think at this point I wanted to just like bring this like phrase up called emerging capabilities, which is something we use when we evaluate these models, and like emerging capabilities is this idea that as you scale models up, they start getting like this capabilities or abilities that they did not have at a smaller scale, and you did not explicitly train the model for that. And it is interesting, like an example of that is to like do in context learning, wherein like you just tell it like write a poem in this format, and then it just learns from one example, and then it can generalize. So you did not train it, you just prompted it with that, and it was able to like learn it. So, and you cannot do these with smaller models. That's an example of emerging capability. Another one is doing this chain of thought reasoning, wherein you ask the model, like, let's think step by step and generate the steps on how you get to that answer. So that, like, the model was not trained in this way, but it got this capability as you scaled up. And these are like all ideas of like, things that come out. So there are a lot of these behavior, like lying is an example of emerging capability. It wasn't taught to lie, but then, because people haven't evaluated and because they don't know what to even evaluate their models for, what kind of capabilities, it's hard to know, like, how to make sure that these models have these proper guardrails. And, so like, I think emerging capabilities is definitely a pressing risk.
Yeah, definitely. So the next question we have is, how many jobs, what jobs do you see being replaced by AI, like especially, or even have been replaced by AI by now, but like in the near future, how many do you see being replaced?
Yeah, so actually, according to the World Economic Forum, AI actually creates jobs in the shorter run than, taking away jobs by automation. But I would say, like, the jobs that involve more like reading a lot of text and summarizing, like I was telling you, that those are like the ones I would say are anyway something that we would expect and hope would get automated. And those are like just better to do and like, more accurate and faster. But I would say, like, there's definitely going to be more jobs that will like augment humans with like AI and like how to work with the AI in an interactive fashion. But the other thing I mentioned is something like coding assistant. I don't see like AI taking like software engineering jobs anytime soon. But then like just like making them more productive and like maybe companies can focus more on like having very highly productive like maybe fewer employees, and that way it would impact jobs. But yeah, I would say like there are like most of the things that I see are mostly monotonous and like finding or like reading a lot of texts and like maybe like creativity to a certain extent. But the way I see like art is that it involves more than just a prompt. It involves a lot of like history and background and feelings and emotions. So I don't see like that being replaced like that quickly.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. So another question is, do you think there will be a day where we see a singularity or a AGI, where an AI system would be able to think for itself? And if so, how far away do you think that day is?
Yeah, so I would say there are definitely some sparks of AGI or artificial general intelligence in the GPT-4 and ChatGPT. They are obviously like, better than humans at some of these tasks or at human levels at some of these tasks. But also like, I've been working on common sense reasoning in neural networks and large language models for a while. And in my experience, I think they lack a lot of common sense. And the reason for that is that, we as humans live in this world and like, we have like these social norms and like day-to-day things, and just by living we pick up on these things that like people generally 3 times a day, they sleep for this many hours and all these different things. And there's like people generally don't write about these things, right? Like, so for example, if I say like you just had lunch, what would your next meal be? And I remember like I used to like ask these to like the earlier versions of GPT-3, and it used to not get that. Like it just did not know how to like function as a person in a real world, and you do not expect it to. So these are more like common sense and like social behaviors that it's very hard for these models to get. Even physical common sense, for example, like when you push something off the table, it falls down because of gravity. These are things that you learn as a kid by interacting with like these objects and these in the real world. It's very hard for these language models to learn. It's just all they're doing is reading a lot of text, so it's hard to get and learn how they're gonna like be in real world like a proper human. So I would say that is one thing that's like definitely lagging. And so even though like there's sparks of AGI, I would say there are definitely gaps which still need to be filled.
Yeah. So you don't think we'll see AGI anytime soon then? Or we won't see it at all?
I would say it is coming in the sense that, yeah, I mean, the way I define it is more like, when they can generalize to a lot of tasks and are good at it at the level of human or even better. I would say, I'm seeing sparks of it definitely in GPT-4. They are good and better than humans at many of these tasks, but they're still not there at the level where I would be like, oh yeah, this is it. Like, this is the thing that is AGI.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. So recently, Elon Musk and like other famous people, they signed a letter to stop advancements in AI for 6 months. So do you share their concerns about the potential risks of AI, and would you also sign such a letter? Because Elon Musk was like one of the original founders of OpenAI, which created ChatGPT, but then he left. So I think it's really interesting that he signed this thing to pause AI developments. But yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so just to give a background, this letter was, released by this Future of Life Institute, and it called for a moratorium on training these large language models for a period of 6 months. So like just put a pause. And a lot of influential people signed it. I talked to a lot of people who signed it as well as people who did not sign it. I would say like when it first came out, I was on the camp of like not signing it, and I'm still at. And my reasons are as follows. So the reason they wanted to like put a pause on it is because they wanted I think maybe it was like the risk associated with it. We need to like assess it more and evaluate it more. And I do resonate with that sentiment. But the reason I do not think this is a good way to to just tell everyone to like stop, training models is because first of all, it would be hard to enforce. How do you make sure that people are not actually training these models? Even if it's by the government, it would be very hard to enforce that. And second thing is it would have this analogy of like the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, in the sense all these big companies that are very powerful already have these models. They actually get more of like this advancement from, these like more like open source communities and people who are trying to build these on their own. And if you just put a pause on them, because they already have these, they can further make them better, because OpenAI is collecting all of our prompts and everything. It can use it for making their models even better. But if you just put a pause, people who do have nothing and they're just starting with everything that's open source, it's just gonna make that gap even further bigger.
Awesome. So where do you see yourself in the next 5 years professionally and personally, and what are your goals and aspirations related to AI or any of the other fields?
Yeah, so I would say in the large language model world that I'm in right now, a month or 6 weeks is like a year at the pace at which things are going right now. So your question would be more like where I see myself 8 months or 1 year from now. So maybe I could just focus on that.
Sure.
So I would say I think generative AI is this powerful, amazing technology. I'm very much aware of the risks and concerned about them as well. I would love to I think we can harness them for a lot of positive things, and I'm hoping that I'll be building something that is going to be very impactful. I see that there's a lot of use cases, especially for things like I said that can be automated. You can think of things even in the enterprise use cases, if you had to onboard a person in a big tech company like Google or Meta, it takes at least 50 emails or more to be sent just to set up this person to be onboarded into a team. A large language model can do that, right? It can send emails, it can schedule things, it can get all these things. It's more like a checklist, right? So it can go through that and do it. And I would say there's so many of these use cases that people haven't explored because they have more focus on the more general capability. So I'm hoping to work on some of these things and hoping to have something that is more impactful. I also hope I'm on the right side of the thing, because it's very hard to navigate this space right now because of how fast it's going. And so I hope I'm not building a moat in the sense that making these powerful companies even more powerful, especially giving control to people in the Bay Area or the Silicon Valley, and more these who are very few people controlling these very powerful technologies.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there's definitely a lot of concerns there. I mean, it's becoming harder and harder to decide what's right, what's wrong, in the sense of is you helping build these things a good thing or a bad thing? So was there any advice that you were given as a kid, maybe from your dad you mentioned, who actually got you interested in AI, or just in general, that you want to share today on this podcast?
I would say one of the things is it's okay to be against the norm. While growing up, I was I was a nerd, which was not very normal in my like school and I was always the one kind of standing out. I was the only hijabi in my college in undergrad back in India. It was very hard, and sometimes it can be even intimidating. I came to the US 10 years ago when I was 21, all by myself. I did not know anyone here. I did not have any family here, just to go to grad school. It was a very lonely time. Even after when I was doing my PhD, I got married, a few years after coming here. My husband supported me a lot, but it's kind of like, you're working on these problems where you don't see like the light at the end of the tunnel, and you're like, should I keep pushing or should I not? And I've like gone through a lot of these phases, like doing my PhD, especially at that time. And it was like very hard. And my mom always like gave me this advice that, you always think that God is there, like there's a bigger power, like, much bigger, much more powerful than all of us. And think of him as like something that is always there. Like, if you feel lonely, like go there, like, you can go to the musalla, like go talk to Allah and like, just like share your things, and, your heart becomes lighter. You feel better. So that was like, I think that advice really helped me. It just, I feel there were like a lot of these moments where I was like, okay, this is the end. I don't know where to go from this. I would get like, my research papers rejected, and we had like this thing like you need to get so many research papers out before you graduate and so on. And so those things like really helped a lot, like, just having that faith in Allah that, you can keep pushing and just leave the rest to God.
Yeah, definitely.
That's awesome. So if there would be any key takeaways, someone listening to this podcast that you would want them to take away, what would they be?
Yeah, I would say like keep hustling and never get like too comfortable. So after I graduated from my PhD, I got like almost like this dream job at Salesforce Research, and it was like a really good company. I was working with like Richard Socher. He's like this really powerful person. He's the founder of U.com now, and I was working on the cutting edge technology. I was building large language models for controllability and like factuality and stuff. And I also like reached a point where I was having a team of like research scientists and interns. And at that point, I went to my husband and I'm like, I think I want to quit. And he was like, are you serious? Like, there's this like in Silicon Valley, there's this idea of like rest and vest. Like, you get to a certain point and like, just do the minimum and then you're still going to be festing. But I realized that I wasn't learning as much as I was in the first few years over there. And so he was shocked and he's like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah. And then I came to know about Hugging Face. I was already using them and working with them. But I was like, okay, I'm going to take a big pay cut and then go there and work as an IC. So like, not have a team, but work as on these things. But I get to learn a lot because, I'm working more closely with what's happening and, on the application level, right? Like, building this technology and impacting people very quickly. And, taking a pay cut, like doing that move with like 2 small kids, it was mind blowing. Like most people are like, even my father was like, are you sure you want to do that? Right. So, but I'm glad I did that. Like, 1 year later, now I'm look back and I'm like, alhamdulillah, it's good because I feel like, the learning has accelerated a lot, like, So I think people tend to get like too comfortable in their current position and they're like, oh, we are doing good. We are climbing the corporate ladder. It's all, all good. And then, but you should know when to pivot and, when to like, figure out that, okay, is this thing, it might not feel like the right move, but, always trust Allah. Like he's going to support you and he's always there. Like, and you've been put in a position, and you were meant to be there, like, that's so Allah only puts you something that you can like bear and like doesn't put more burden on a soul more than it can take, right? And so I think that trust and that faith in Allah is extremely important.